Death of Sorrow is the third official release from Sorrow, and a very classic death doom metal band from, I believe, originally kind of the Long Island area of New York, who formed back in the late 80s and certainly made a name for themselves quickly with like an early, I think, Relapse release. They really sort of made their mark as a death thrash metal band, a thrashing death metal band, along the lines of a lot of the groups in New York at the time, who were sort of becoming that new generation of the first generation of death metal out of that area. And hey, they were good at it. They were getting noticed. They're playing shows with like Pyrexia and Suffocation and their most nascent deal under their old name. So if you go back and listen to Apparitions, probably their 7-inch, the Eternally Forgotten Curse of the Sunrise, you see that the band basically knew who they were at that point in terms of what the lyrics were all about, what their basic style was. They still had a little bit further to go as Sorrow in terms of incorporating what most people know them for, which is death doom metal. And this precedence is pretty important because over the next just couple of years, they would release an EP and an album through a bit of hardship that would really exemplify what doom metal could add to death metal that was still thrashing and aggressive. So not only was this a band with riffs, this was one of those bands. They were good at all of it. They were good at the 80s doom metal influenced stuff. They were good at the death thrash stuff, and they sounded like a death metal band of the time. Now, in the review, I kind of say, like, you could have said, well, this band sounds a little bit like early Death in some respects. The same way you could say Gorguts kind of did, and a couple other bands at the time that eventually evolved. And this band evolved pretty quickly. I think that their first full-length Hatred and Disgust, it belongs in maybe a conversation alongside like Beyond Belief and Winter and those, but it was more sophisticated than those records. It was a little bit more just higher quality in terms of its general interpretations of death metal. And so my pitch for that album is spiritual healing plus forest of equilibrium. And, see however you will, but I've always been a big sort of hype man for Sorrow because they're overlooked despite how good they were. And despite, maybe some of their aspects of their sound were similar or typical at around that time, but they had more places to go before they were dropped from their label. Now, I like this kind of history, and you kind of need it going into Death of Sorrow because basically what this is songs written in 1992 and 1993 that were put to rehearsal, fully written. The album was pretty much done before they were dropped, and they all kind of decided to go do other things. So how does Sorrow sound in, literally like 30 years later? We'll listen to a clip right now. So thankfully, Sorrow sounds like they always did. This is certainly a modern recording and all that, but there's something to be said for a band coming back after 30 years and sounding like themselves. And having those songs that were written back then really helps them, uh, remind us that they weren't mediocre back then, that they were quite good back then, and they've delivered these songs in an authentic way, which feels both very calculated in terms of treating that material quite well and as it was intended, but also presenting a modern product that is mixed well, sounds great, and showcases the bass guitar tone and gives you a lot of texture that you would want from a classic old school death metal record. And so while a lot of people might think, well, it's just another old school death metal band coming back and doing their thing, whatever, but this is different. This is one of those underground bands that Death Doom fans certainly should know about and value quite a bit. They were quite influential over the years. It's kind of like if Ripping, like I say in the review right there, if Ripping Corpse came back and re-recorded their incomplete, unreleased 1992 album, it would be a huge deal. And from my point of view, it is a big deal that Death of Sorrow got released and recorded. So if you don't have that precedence and you don't really understand what this band is all about, I think that if you like everything from Bolt Thrower to Master to Death to, again, any of the bands I've mentioned earlier, there's a sense of a well-rounded solution to what old school death metal was in 1992, right? There's Death Doom, there's Death Thrash, there's the sort of progressive death metal touches, there's some heavier traditional Doom notes guiding it all together, and there's like a socio-political and environmental angle to their lyrics, which has always been more profound than a lot of their peers. So, not to be a cheerleader, but it's great to see that this band could return and do the thing and do it as well as they ever did. So, for me, that's a rare case of a band delivering upon, you know, well beyond their expiration date, with something that's just as valuable as their old school stuff. And that's without hyperbole. I think this record is as good as Hatred and Disgust. We could leave off one of the re-recordings of an earlier demo track. It doesn't really fit. And the outro to the album is not particularly great. But this still gets very high marks for me. I think this is just a great record and a very high recommendation. But temper my enthusiasm, because I've worked with these guys, at least one of these guys, on other releases, and my enthusiasm comes as a fan in a way that, like, I rated that Hell Witch record very high, right? So take that with a grain of salt, if you will. But check it out, give it a chance. If you like Hatred and Disgust, I guarantee you'll like this record. That's it.
Is only a distraction.